Trees go up because they are used to growing among other plants. They want to be above those. And if you put them in a wide open area, most trees are going to need something to begin with. If you go out to somewhere like Lusaka National Park, where there's a lot of grazers around and a lot of other pressures around, you won't see a young tree popping up by itself. It'll be in a thicket of something else. This is how, in a natural system, most trees will come up.
So today we're visiting my barefoot brother here, who last year planted an entire forest of trees. Am I lying?
I don't know. It depends how you define forest. It was over 500, I think, in the end.
Yeah.
I was trying to do one every day, and as you know, sometimes there were complications, but I think we got there, more or less.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, William actually undertook to plant a tree a day for the whole of 2023 on his family plot. So today we have the good fortune to come and actually check in on those trees and see how well they did. Was it worth it?
I think it was a mistake, is the short term. We've got our guavas, of course, that pop up everywhere. I don't plant them, they just grow. Generally, ipe, like we've talked about. And this is the lovely albit here. Really lovely leaves to touch.
And they've got nice, like, soft texture to them.
They have, and again, this one is such an ornamental tree. Should be more used, but it isn't easy to transplant. It's very easy to grow if you scatter the seeds, but very difficult to transplant. And this is something we don't like, but it is slowly being excluded.
Where did this idea come from? Why did you decide to plant 500 trees?
So sort of, I had been procrastinating for a while on the idea of foresting the whole area. I'd done little bits and pieces, but I wanted to give myself a target that was much clearer and much harder to sort of wriggle around. And wasn't necessarily the best year to choose it because I did have a few bouts of illness and
a little bit of drought.
And yeah, it was. The drought did not help. There were definitely a few losses that would not have happened in a year like this. When we're looking to be in La Nina conditions, which are much wetter for this part of Zambia, drier for other parts, but we were very dry, so that was not ideal. So
what was your strategy? What was the game plan once you decided you're going to do 365 trees?
Because I decided it quite last minute, it was find something that will survive and start stockpiling things that will be plantable, because I knew from day one there's going to be a big block in the middle of that's going to be a challenge, because right in the middle of the dry season there's very few things that want to be going into the ground right then, especially in winter. I actually found the worst time of year for survival was right at the end of the rainy season and right at the beginning of the rainy season, because there's a window where things are very much more sensitive. They're already growing, and if things don't go just right,
they'll die.
It can go very wrong. But generally speaking, it was a case of trying to work out what would go when, planting forest plants in the rainy season and more open area plants in the dry season. Some of them I could propagate from friends' trees, some of them I propagate from myself from seed, and then I had to buy quite a few of the sort of more exotic type trees that I wanted. A lot of fruit trees were bought in. And then it was a case of trying to create a micro environment around each one which would support it as best as possible. We've got one of my dry season trees. So this is not a tree that I would have planted if I'd had options at the time. So this is a Delanix regia, which you probably know as the flamboyant. It's a very common parkland tree here. It's very pretty, not the best for the soil. It is a legume. It does actually fertilize the soil a bit, so here it works quite well. But it is from Madagascar, which makes it reasonably climatically suited. But because this went in the dry season when I didn't have options, what I wanted was something to shelter it from the winter sun. So this is north, and this is where the winter sun comes from. And so we put this great big aloe right over the base of it, so that shades it off. I did have a big Dracaena here, which did its job before dying back. So this was significantly taller. The main stem has fallen down, but it's coming back up, and that was taking away the afternoon sun in the west. And then all around the base, just to keep humidity around those young tender roots, I planted this Madagascan Calico Fetchinkoi, which is a very common, very easy to propagate garden plant. You just snap all this off and shove it in the ground, which was my general strategy with companion plants. I didn't want to be spending money on those. I wanted those to be things I could very cheaply make more of. And so then that will exclude a lot of the weeds around it, also protect it from fire if fire does come through, which fortunately it hasn't. But that will then also make sure there's a nice humid microclimate right around the base where it really needs it. And so although it suffered a little in the drought, so you can see some dieback, there's some nice fresh growth coming back up in spite of that. You can see here, I've got a sort of circle of trees, native and non-native. I've pruned quite a lot and that's changed the soil already. So you can see the grass has gone down a fair bit already. But this is the star chestnut. So this one really, once it's gone in, provided it goes in the right time of year, no additional care required. It is slow growing once it's mature, but it seems to be really fast when it's young, even in bad years. And you can see these fantastic massive leaves will be really great for the soil when they do fall off.
Beautiful leaves.
Really.
It's like dinosaur foot.
Yeah, it does. You'll see a lot of them growing in the escarpments, the very bright white trunks when they're mature.
And I remember you mentioned this.
Yeah, the sand olive. So this is one I did plant a couple of, but most of the time I don't have to, because most areas here, this comes up by itself. And this is a sort of classic succession tree. So this moves into dead soils, and then you'll see a few of them have started to fall down as they get more mature. As the soil closes up a bit, they don't last. But it's beautiful green leaves, really fantastic, very small flowers for pollinators, then very pretty pink pods, which just coat them late in the dry season. And yeah, so it's Dodonia viscosa. It does have some medicinal uses. I think it's used in some brewery because some people call it wild hops. But it's a fantastic native tree for stabilizing soils that nothing else will grow in. Yeah, just very pretty little thing, but don't expect it to stick around once other things start coming up. You'll see quite a big one there that's already in decline. A few branches have already broken off it. Because they just can't compete once everything else gets going. One of the things you can see here, you can see 5 malinas along this line. Well, one of them is still quite small, it's lagging a bit. Okay. We did have termites come under it. What you can't see is that there were also 4? Yeah, there should have been 4 bridelias in here, which is a native timber tree, which is very much a forest tree. And there is one still growing, if we can find it in amongst all this growth. A bit further on. Should be. Sorry. Yeah, here we go. So it was actually 6 malinas. All 6 are growing, even though this one is a little bit small. But bridelias did not take nearly so well. I suspected they might not, but I had a lot coming up in areas where they couldn't be left. And so I was taking them out of pathways, taking them out of places where they would have to be removed, and trying to find places they could survive. Unfortunately, full sun, although if you look at a lot of websites about having them as an ornamental, because they are a very ornamental tree when they're mature, here they do not want full sun. This was the only one of 5 that survived once it started drying out, once we started getting that El Nino sun. But I would say somewhere between 2/3 and maybe 3/4 of the things I planted are still alive. There are some groups where it was much lower success. Like cheese, I tried some of them in far more light than they were willing to tolerate for that year. When they're small, when they're tender, because those are all from seed. Deep shade was the only way forward. I did manage some in open environments, but again by entirely encircling them in much bigger shade plants. Okay.
And I think one of the things you also kind of mentioned indirectly is how essential you're coming to water and maintain the plants through the year.
Yeah, so it did vary. It was one of the nice things about a lot of the indigenous trees, so like the sausage trees all over the place. They stood up very well if I had to go away and I didn't have time to come around and water. But most of the time I was trying to get around every 2 weeks during the dry season and water. There is a little bit of flexibility with that, especially with things like these malinas, things like the sausage trees, things like Pachira. In fact, quite a lot of the Pachiras out at the front, those survived several months at one point without any additional water in the dry season. They are very tough, as I said. I have previously planted in wetter years and done no additional watering and found those actually do fine. But for these last 2 very dry years, I did want to just give things that little boost.
Yeah, because it wasn't enough moisture.
It just wasn't enough.
So what time of the year would be best, in your opinion, if someone's not willing to plant a tree a day?
I would say if I was to do this again, I would try and plant all those trees probably between mid-December and February. That is your ideal window as far as I can tell in this sort of area. If you have a heavier soil, you can probably extend that a little bit because your soil is going to retain that moisture longer. And if you are in a much more open, drier area, I would say it's somewhere around Livingston, you really want to focus that right in the middle of the rains. I found early rains, late rains were a problem, but right in the middle was a real sweet spot. Got one of the indigenous figs here. This probably not indigenous, absolutely indestructive thing is indestructible. It is very good for planting in very open areas. It is very hard to kill, but you don't want to plant it in high densities because it will create dead soil. In low densities, like guavas, it will create just a more varied soil, but if you plant it in dense stands of just this, nothing else will grow. But as you can see, in a mixed place, it's absolutely fine. It's not going to create an issue, but never in dense stands. So this is Euphorbia tyricale, so it's a pencil tree. So you will see it in a lot of rural areas of Zambia used as a goat fence, and it's very effective on that because if you break this, you see this white sap starts to come out. Yeah. So as goats push through that, that gets stuck in their fur. It is an irritant if it's left on the skin for too long. And so on goat skin, that will really irritate them and they'll very quickly learn not to push through it. Which goats learning is itself a challenge.
So now that you're 2 years in, well, it is 2 years, right?
It's 2 years since the start, yeah.
Second rainy season. Is this when you're going to stop managing the plants, like the dry season
So
watering?
I'm going to see at the end of these rains. It's trees like this, but I'm not planning on watering this again at all. It should be fully self-sufficient by now. Sandal the same, the malign is the same. Depending how things are looking as we dry out at the end of this year, a lot of them should be independent. Some will always need care. I planted a balsa. That is very much from a different environment to here. That will always require some additional water, at least until it's 3 or 4 years old, when it will be bigger. But I suspect even then, at least once a month, I'll have to give it some supplementary water. Plants like this, most of the plants in this area, in this open space, they've all been picked because they should be quite hardy. So once they're fully established, I shouldn't need to do any extra care. But things like the loquats, they're not from this climate originally. They can be very hardy in this climate, but I will keep an eye and they will warn you long before they suffer damage. They have these fantastic big leaves. You can see one off in the distance there. Those will droop quite markedly if they're getting water stressed, which does take a lot, but then I will know this is something. So I'll keep monitoring, but hopefully this dry season, most things won't need additional water. So we'll see. Our Zambian woodlands are really tough. Miombo is a fantastic, really resilient environment. It can stand a lot, but one thing it can't stand is a combination of being chopped and burned. If you are harvesting your local woodlands for charcoal and chopping them regularly, you have to exclude the fires, otherwise they won't keep coming up. They will manage for a few years, but they won't manage indefinitely. And it is really heartwarming to see in areas where people are protecting their trees how well they come back up and how much more use you can get out of that. But it is heartbreaking to see in many areas where that's not being done and where people, often from not the area where it's happening, are coming in, they're chopping down the trees, people going by on the roads, lighting fires, because we have this thing in Zambia where we don't like standing grass, and it doesn't help the soil and it doesn't help the trees when it happens annually. A few fires here and there the Miombo can take with no problem at all. So if you're just burning locally for your pasture or for your gardening, that's not a problem. But when there's big landscape-wide fires happening every year, a lot of these trees just won't cope. And if these big trees won't cope, it makes it a lot harder because they have so much an impact on how much rainfall we get and how even it is and how much flooding we get. It makes it a lot harder for you to plant your own useful home trees, your mango trees, your avocado trees. All of those benefit from having an intact woodland. So we do need to bear in mind that it's tough, but it's not indestructible.